How did Sheryl Sandberg, the author of Lean In and COO of Facebook, handle the sudden death of her husband and father of her 2 sons? She'll join us, along with her best-selling co-author, Adam Grant, to talk about their new book, Option B.
You can't perfectly control it. The grief comes and goes on its own time, and everyone grieves in their own way. But knowing there are steps you can take, and for me, knowing that there have been research that proves that those steps help, I was just like, oh my God, even if it only is one tiny thing, it's something I can do.
Just how seriously has the American government taken ESP? Annie Jacobsen will tell us about her new book, Phenomena, The Secret History of the U.S. Government's Investigations into Extrasensory Perception and Psychokinesis.
I didn't want to prove or disprove either side. I wanted to interview the dedicated scientists and psychics who believe in this work and work in this field. And I also wanted to interview the scientific skeptics who find this abhorrent.
Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Joining us now is Sheryl Sandberg and Adam Grant, co-authors of the new book, Option B, Facing Adversity, Building Resilience, and Finding Joy. Sheryl Sandberg is, of course, also the author of Lean In and the COO of Facebook, and Adam Grant, best-selling author of Originals and Give and Take. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So this book, I believe, started as a Facebook post, which was very highly read, incredibly moving post. Talk about why you decided to post what you did on Facebook and what was in that post for those few people who didn't see it.
I lost my husband, Dave, 2 years ago, and it's the unimaginable. I found him. We were on vacation celebrating a friend's 50th birthday party in a gym. I flew home to tell a 7 and a 10-year-old, my children, that they'd never see their father again. And, the grief that followed was something I'd really never been prepared for. It felt like there was a void closing in on me. My brother-in-law talked about it as a boot pushing on his chest. It felt like every day, every week was a month, was a year. And it wasn't just the grief, it was the isolation. Before Dave died, I dropped my kids off at school. People said hi. I walk into the office. Everyone chit-chats, but not so much because I think people were so afraid to say the wrong thing. They most likely didn't say anything. And so I was just feeling worse and worse and worse. The Jewish period of mourning for a spouse is called Sheloshim. It's 30 days from burial. And so I'd been keeping a journal, and as that day approached, I wrote a Facebook post, which is what I would say to everyone if I were going to say something. And the night before I went to bed thinking there is 0 chance I'm posting this. It is just crazy open. And I woke up the next day and it was so awful. I thought this is supposed to be the end of mourning. It couldn't feel worse. Things can't get worse, so maybe they'll get better. And I hit post. And it didn't take away the grief at all, but it did help with the isolation because it just broke open the conversation and kicked the elephant out of the room. My friend from work told me she'd been driving by my house for a month but hadn't come in. She started coming in. A woman from the NICU, a stranger, posted that she had just lost one twin and was trying to give the surviving twin a great life. And another woman who had lost a twin posted to her. And it was for me remembering, okay, I'm facing this horrible tragedy, but I am not alone. So many other people face adversity of all kinds. And when we talk about it, we can help each other get through it.
You actually use some of those comments on your Facebook post in the book. At what point did you decide that this was more than just a Facebook post? It was something that you wanted to continue in book form?
Adam and I have tried to remember when we started writing the book, and we're not quite sure. I journaled a lot for 5 months, and it was sometime after that. And it was interesting because at the time I was journaling, I always wanted to journal my whole life, and I never did. I would start journals every New Year's. January 5th, I was done. I have a big box of them. But after Dave died, I wrote. And if I didn't write for a couple of days, I felt like I was going to burst. And I learned later when I was doing the research with Adam for the book how important journaling can be to recovery.
Yeah, it's amazing. I never would have expected that just a few minutes of writing could make such a difference for people's not only mental health, but physical health too. But there are hundreds of experiments showing that if people just journal like 15 minutes at a time, a few times about a traumatic event, that at first they feel worse because it's not fun to relive the experience. But over the next few weeks and months, they actually end up becoming happier and healthier. And it turns out it takes a tremendous amount of energy to bottle up emotions. And journaling seems to help with people expressing it. And then there's also just the forming a story, finding some coherence and, a path forward. And I think that was really clear in Sheryl's journal, which turned into a big chunk of the book.
You worked on this as collaborators. How did that actually work? I'm curious about the mechanics. Did you have a Google Doc that you shared across the country, or did you email chapters back and forth?
We did a lot of iterating. I would say Sheryl initiated all the personal content, her story. I usually wrote the first draft of the research, and we sort of took turns on other people's stories, and we just sent them back and forth a lot. Between the two of us and our editor, Nell Scovell, I think we averaged over 200 versions of each chapter.
Wow.
Yeah, when chapter 1 got to version 200, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry.
Did you know from the beginning that the final book would take the form that it did, which is Sheryl, you writing in the first person, and Adam, you're sort of in the background there?
We actually tried to write it with we. I would have rather done that because it really was a book we wrote together.
It's a terrible idea.
It was just hard to talk about we when it was Dave who died, and Adam wasn't there for most of those moments. And we just tried to switch back and forth, and it was just too distracting. So we tried to write it in the first person, but explain that it was really written by both of us. And we've had the same goal in this, which is, living through this was unimaginable for me. And Adam said it was one of the hardest things he ever saw a close friend go through. And in the early days, Adam kept telling me, it's going to get better. My 30-day Facebook post, I wrote the sentence, I will never feel another moment of pure joy again.
Right.
And I believed it and meant it. And Adam said, don't publish that, don't post that, it's not true. But I posted it because I knew it was true. And I was wrong. And we want people to believe that they will feel joy.
Adam, did you have some personal tragedy that you sort of kept in mind? So much of this is about Sheryl's personal experience, but did you have something that sort of helped frame it for you?
I had two that sort of were really relevant to a lot of my thinking in the book. One was I had a student in 2010, first class I taught at Penn. He was the captain of the football team. His name was Owen Thomas, and he was just beloved by all of his classmates. A few months later, he reached out to me, came by my office looking for career advice, and then not long after that, he died by suicide. And we were all shocked, and I seriously thought about giving up on teaching. Eventually, he was diagnosed with CTE,
So there was a medical cause
injury, which made me feel less like, I should have noticed something was wrong. But that was really hard, and the whole campus grieved over that experience. And then in 2012, our closest family friend, Jeff Zaslow, who was a writer, was killed in a car accident. It was, shocking, and I had a really hard time with that. I played these endless loops in my head over and over again of, when I last talked to him, what if I had stayed on the phone 10 seconds longer? Every event in his life would have been different. Maybe he wouldn't have been on the same icy road at the same time. And my wife, Allison, she has a psychiatry background. She shared with me something that really changed the way I thought about that event, which I ended up then sharing with Sheryl years later. She said, you have to realize that this could be worse. I was like, this could not be worse. Like, this extraordinary person lost his life halfway through. And she said, well, people have car accidents with their families in the car too. And, you have to remember that you're lucky that, his children were not in the car. And that really helped me move on with that. And it ended up being something that was really relevant when Sheryl and I were talking about what happened to Dave.
In the book, you write about how Adam told you not to focus on the positive, that at first, at the very beginning, that everyone was telling you to focus on the positive, and Adam had some very different advice for you.
Yeah, I mean, Adam is one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. But one day he looked at me and said, you should think about how things could be worse. And I thought he was a total idiot. What do you mean things could be worse?
Right.
Dave just died. Suddenly. I found him on a gym floor, and he looked at me and he said, well, Dave could have had that same cardiac arrhythmia driving your children. And you say that, and in that instant, I am fine. I'm like, okay, my kids are alive. I'm good. To this day, if I need it, I think about that. And it was so counterintuitive to go through what is the worst experience of your life, but come out on the other side feeling more grateful. But I am. I mean, I sit here today, almost 2 years, and I'm sadder, but I appreciate life in a way I never did before. My cousin Laura, who lives in New York, turned 50 2 months ago, and I called her that morning and I said, happy birthday. I'm calling to wish you a happy birthday. But I'm also calling in case she woke up that morning with that, oh my God, I'm 50 thing. I used to do that. Because this is the year Dave won't turn 50. I will never make another joke about growing old again. because it turns out there's two paths. Some people grow old and some people don't. And the first is way better than the second. And I said to Laura, I'm so grateful you're turning 50. I will never take a year for granted again.
That whole theme of like it could be worse is woven throughout the book. It seems like you take pains to say like, look, this is a tragic thing for me, but I'm aware that other people suffer even greater tragedies. And you continue to point that out and to sort of contextualize your own experience and sort of the grand, fabric of trauma. Did part of you feel like I need to do this so that people understand that I'm putting this into perspective, that people sort of don't have a reaction of like, oh, well, easy for her to say, or people are suffering all over the place?
Nothing saved my kids and I from this.
Yeah.
Death is the great equalizer. We all face it. Katie Couric interviewed us last night at the 92nd Street Y, and she said, I like to say we're all terminal. Just a question of when. But in the face even of trauma, resources matter. And I know that I have resources that few people have. I've thought so much about so many families going through situations like mine and worrying about paying a healthcare bill. How many women woke up this morning in our country and had to face the unfathomable choice between taking care of a sick kid and losing a job that's keeping a roof over their heads? That's unacceptable. We need to do better. There's so much adversity out there, and it is not evenly distributed.
One of the things I liked about the stories that you share in the book is that not everyone is sort of like a paradigm of virtue and perfection. There's a lot of failure in there, personal failure, as well as sort of things that happen that you can't control. And I'd like to bring up one of the names and have you tell her story, which was Catherine Hoke.
I met Kat at a conference last year and was just, I don't even know the word. I was like flabbergasted when she started speaking. Here was a woman who was described as an angel because in her 20s, she quit her venture capital job, which was very lucrative, and started a nonprofit to help prisoners figure out how they could re-enter the workforce and even start their own businesses. She noticed that a lot of prisoners had some of the same qualities that she had always admired in successful entrepreneurs: grit and ingenuity. And then she ended up getting divorced. Her husband left her suddenly. Mm-hmm. She had a really hard time with that, and she turned to the people that she had been the closest to, which were the graduates of her program, former inmates. And she ended up having inappropriate relationships with multiple of these graduates. It wasn't illegal because they were no longer in prison, but she was basically told her program would be banned from prisons unless she stepped down. So she resigned. She wrote a public letter to the 7,000 supporters of her program. And she went through therapy. She really spent a year rebuilding her life. And then she said, I've spent my whole life trying to give people second chances. And now I'm going to get my second chance at giving other people second chances. So she started a new program called Defy Ventures, where she's now gotten about 1,500 people into starting businesses and to reemployment. And it's an incredibly moving program.
A lot of what inspired her to move forward was feedback from other people who said, like, actually, you were incredibly helpful and who were very compassionate for her situation. And it struck me in reading this book that it's not just about recovering from tragedy yourself. A lot of this is actually about helping people deal with people who are recovering from tragedy. And I'm curious, did you know from the beginning that you wanted to help other people sort of know what to say when someone dies and what not to say and what to avoid?
We did. Our goal in writing the book is not just to speak to people facing adversity, but really to speak to the people around them. Because I realized I didn't get most of this right before. I used to think if someone was going through something hard, cancer, job loss, a death, the first time I saw them, I would say I was sorry, but then I wouldn't bring it up again because it was up to them to bring it up. And if I brought it up, I would be reminding them.
So it's like
that's
absurd.
absurd.
Space.
You can't remind me Dave died. I know Dave died. I know Dave died every day, all the time. So when people didn't say anything, it felt like they weren't acknowledging the pain. Helping other people acknowledge the pain. The power of the word we. I used to say to people, you're going to get through this. Well, if you have a cancer diagnosis, the voice in their head is then saying, you don't know that.
Right.
What is so much better is, I don't know if you're going to get through this, but you're not going to go through it alone because I will go through it with you. We will get through this together, or we will try to get through this together. The power of doing something specific. I used to say to people, is there anything I can do? And I meant it. I was coming from a good place, but it kind of shifts the burden to the person to answer the question. It's a very hard question to answer. When I was on the other side of this, I would think to myself, well, you can make Father's Day go away so I never have to live through it again. My dear friends, Dan and Esther Levy, beautiful couple, they lost a child tragically, and they were in the hospital for many months. And a friend of his texted and said, "What do you not want on a burger?" And then showed up with the burger. Rather than offer to do anything, do something.
In the book, Sheryl, you are incredibly personal. It's a really brave book. You write about crying in meetings, about being distracted, about going to work foggy, brained, and also about very intimate moments, about the moment when you told your children what happened and their reactions. Did you have trepidation around opening up about these things?
Yes. But I know why. I wrote this book with Adam and why we started optionb.org, the community where we're trying to help bring people together for resilience. My favorite story in the book is the story of a man named Joe Casper. And he lost his son. He's a doctor, so he dealt with other people's life and death, but then he lost his own son. So he went back to get a degree in psychology where he was Adam's student and met Adam. And he talks about his concept of co-destiny, that when he helps other bereaved parents, which he now does on the side of his day job, he's keeping his son's legacy alive. My husband was amazing. At the funeral, I'll never forget this, our friend Xander said, "Who here had their life changed by Dave Goldberg?" And a sea of hands went up. Mm-hmm. Their life changed. And it's true because he was that generous and that giving. In Adam's language, he was a huge giver. And so if he were alive still, and he should be alive still. He died at 47. He would be doing so much good. And so if Option B can help anyone recover from anything in his name, I think it honors his legacy.
The other thing that struck me in reading the book is that it felt like, and I mean this in the best way, it felt like a really great Facebook feed embodied in a book because it was a mixture of, very personal sharing and then kind of collective wisdom and other people's stories. And then you had like your news posts, which I imagine, Adam, you fed a lot of that in, studies about, the 3 Ps that help you get over a tragic experience and sort of data points. And I'm curious if you see that analogy at all.
I had not thought of that, but I love that. I mean, the book really has 3 parts. It's my story, the research, and other people's stories. So I hadn't thought about it as a news feed, but I love that.
So now that's your new point.
I love that.
Yeah, never thought about it that way. But when we sat down, Sheryl didn't want it to be about her. Yeah, I remember a little bit of like dragging, kicking, and screaming of saying like, no, you really do have to share your story. People are interested in that.
Yeah.
And Sheryl is so often focused on others that, she doesn't want the spotlight on her personally. But I think, she realized, especially after seeing the reaction to the Facebook post, that this really meant something to people when she was able to open up and be so vulnerable. And then we said, look, but we don't just want to write about grief. We have a lot more to say about how to build resilience in the face of all kinds of adversity. And very often there are things that you can learn from, how to deal with one kind of hardship that apply to another. And so we said, we want to cover the best insights from psychology that are relevant here, a lot of which Sheryl put into action. Mm-hmm. And then, we want to capture what we've learned from so many people who have opened up and shared their stories.
This is all very recent. I mean, Dave died 2 years ago. And I'm curious, was this process of writing the book therapeutic for you? Was it cathartic? I imagine sometimes it was painful.
The parts of the book that are the personal parts that really are the painful parts to live through, to write, were really written for my journal. And so I didn't write them for the book, so I didn't have to sit down and do that.
You'd already done it.
I'd already done it. It was, working with Adam to figure out what I could share and what I would share. The other parts of the book, which were the research and other people's stories, for me were incredibly cathartic. I mean, when you go through loss, it is a complete sense of loss of control. And people talk about this. Any form of adversity, cancer, death, losing a job, you lose control. And you can't perfectly control it. The grief comes and goes on its own time, and everyone grieves in their own way. But knowing there are steps you can take, and for me, knowing that there have been research that proves that those steps help, I was just like, oh my God, even if it only is one tiny thing, it's something I can do. Mm-hmm. And we hope this book gives people something they can do, not just for themselves, but to help others. And the stories of other people, the stories in this book, from Catherine Hogue to Joe Casper to Kevin and Marina Krim to Stephen Thompson, these are people who have overcome unbelievable odds and tragedy And they've not just overcome them, but they've rebounded. And they have found meaning and they have found joy. And writing those stories, talking to those people, for me, that was so inspiring. And I think other people will be really inspired by them too.
Let's end on a very positive note. After Lean In, you created Lean In Circles. I think you have now 30,000 Lean In Circles. And you are trying to do a similar thing with Option B.
My foundation launched optionb.org. And the idea is to help people come together in the face of adversity. There's educational material up there, how to help yourself, how to help a friend. And there are all these different Facebook groups, from loss to job loss to hate to discrimination to violence. My mom's friend has a friend whose only child died by suicide 3 years ago. And a couple days ago, she got on optionb.org and she connected with a man who was thinking about committing suicide, and she felt that she helped him. And she told my mom's friend that it was the first moment since her son died she felt like there was some good that came out of it. We know not every story has a happy ending, and we know what tragedy is like. We also know that we're too often isolated in dealing with it. And so the idea behind optionb.org is certainly not to solve every problem, but it is to bring people together so that they can support each other. And we're really excited that that's already happening.
I have to say, the book has been out for like 5 seconds. It's already #1 on Amazon. And I think that's not just about having like one mega best-selling author write a book with another mega best-selling author. The book, again, is Option B, Facing Adversity, Building Resilience, and Finding Joy by Sheryl Sandberg and Adam Grant. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Annie Jacobsen joins us now from Los Angeles. Her new book is called Phenomena, The Secret History of the U.S. Government's Investigation into Extrasensory Perception and Psychokinesis. Annie, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Actually, the subtitle of your book could be much longer, right? Because it includes everything from telekinesis to telepathy to psychoenergetics to many things that I have never heard of. So a big subject. How did you decide to write a book about it?
Well, as a national security reporter, I write about war and weapons and national security and secrets. And I was fascinated to learn that across 7 decades now, the intelligence community and the Defense Department have been actively researching what is now called anomalous mental cognition. And also across these decades, they have gone operational with programs in this bizarre and sometimes quasi-supernatural field.
Your third book, the one that you wrote immediately before this, was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, The Pentagon's Brain. Was it in researching that book that you started to become interested in this?
It was, because The Pentagon's Brain addresses the most advanced technological world that exists today, and that is being led by the Defense Department through its agency called DARPA. And I wanted to look at the other end of the spectrum, the so-called squishy science, which Phenomena falls into, because there is such a debate between scientific skeptics and those who are in the work as to whether or not this kind of investigation is a waste of federal taxpayer money, whether it's nonsense, or whether it could lead to more advanced technology and intelligence collection that only the CIA has access to.
But to talk about things like spoon bending, even the term squishy science seems kind of generous. I mean, how much science is there to these subjects that you looked into?
That's what I looked at, and I tried to address it as the neutral journalist, meaning I didn't want to prove or disprove either side. I wanted to interview the dedicated scientists and psychics who believe in this work and work in this field. And I also wanted to interview the scientific skeptics who find this abhorrent. When you talk about spoon bending, that falls under the rubric of what would be called psychokinesis.
Mm-hmm.
It's the ability to move matter with the mind. And the reason why the Defense Department wanted to look into that as a concept was if there was any legitimacy behind it, they feared that perhaps electronic systems could be interrupted by certain individuals who had this so-called power. The psychokinesis programs did not get advanced. That's the generous way of putting it.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other side, the extrasensory perception programs, that ability to know the unknown, to divine the future, did get advanced, even to the point where the Defense Intelligence Agency was running a program called Project P, and the P stands for prophecy.
Let's talk about the scope of this work. How much money has the military and the intelligence community in the United States spent on research in these areas?
I would say it would be very difficult to provide a convincing number because even the scientists working in this field will agree with the fact that things are in part buried and in part partitioned off to other programs. Having written a book about DARPA where there is a $3 billion a year annual budget, and that's pretty much back to the origin of DARPA in 1958, adjusted for inflation. If you look at $3 billion a year, and you look at the psychic programs, which were probably in the millions to tens of millions, you're talking about a great disparity. And I think in sum, I would say that it was not necessarily a huge waste of money.
Let's go back and talk about the origins of these programs as funded and run by the government. How did the government get involved in research into things like ESP and clairvoyance?
You know, having written 4 books now about war and weapons and national security, it amazes me that the origin story of so many programs leads back to the Nazis. The phenomena programs are no different. At the end of World War II, our intelligence collection agency called Operation Alsace grabbed a huge cache of Nazi documents from Heinrich Himmler that were called Das Ahnenerbe. And inside of that, there was a trove of information about the work that the Nazis were doing in this area. The Soviets found the other half of the cache of documents, and they began working in this field, looking at whether or not extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, were fact or were fantasy. And because the Soviets were doing it, we needed to do it, and that's really the origin story of the psychic arms race.
So this was another area like the race to the moon where the Cold War was sort of a driving force behind the progress.
And it creates a bit of a catch-22, and it creates lots of polemics. You know, one side will say, a huge waste of money, we're only doing this because the Soviets are doing it. But the other side will say, but yes, what if the Soviets are onto something that we're not onto? And, you know, the snake begins to eat its own tail.
Did you find any of it persuasive?
Whether or not extrasensory perception exists is up to science to determine. And what I found most interesting is that whereas my original idea going into the book, or my original understanding, was that the remote viewing programs, the extrasensory perception programs that really began in earnest in the 70s and continued through the middle 90s, ended at that point. And what I found in researching phenomena is that these programs have recently been rebooted under the rubric of advanced technology. So here we are again with a whole new generation of scientists trying to determine whether extrasensory perception is fact or fantasy. And they have different names for it. They call it anomalous human cognition instead of extrasensory perception. The Office of Naval Research calls it the spidey sense. And I think it begs the question, which is, again, a little bit of the chicken and the egg scenario, is will this mystery be solved by modern technology, or is it a fool's errand? Are these new generations of scientists pursuing the same goal, the unattainable goal that the parapsychologists of the 70s so intensely saw.
Are there technology companies that are looking into this? Is any of this happening in the private sector?
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the great surprises to me was that at Stanford University, which is where a lot of the programs with the CIA were going on in the 1970s, specifically today at a laboratory called the Nolan Laboratory, a group of the former CIA scientists and physiologists have teamed up with Dr. Gary Nolan of that lab and are working in the field of genomics to try and determine if there is a genetic component to the so-called supernormals.
In at least one case, the space race and the investigation into the paranormal kind of meet in one character, Edgar Mitchell. Tell us about him.
Ed Mitchell of the Apollo 14 mission experiences a conversion event on the way back from the moon that I write about in Phenomena. And his whole outlook on life changes. He quits NASA, he divorces his wife, he makes all new friends and colleagues, and he dedicates the rest of his life to the study of extrasensory perception and psychokinesis. He was ridiculed for this. But I found it fascinating that a man of science had a conversion event and pursued this until his recent death. And I found his story to be compelling. And I urge people to look at it with, from two sides of the coin, so to speak.
What happened on that Apollo flight that led to this conversion? How does he describe it?
I saw a photograph when I was researching DARPA of a man on the moon reading a document. And I wanted to know what the astronaut was reading on the moon. It was Ed Mitchell. I went to him and I asked him what he was reading, and he told me that he was reading a map. And the reason that he was reading a map on the moon was because he and Alan Shepard had gotten lost. And Mitchell's conversion event on the way home from the moon stemmed from the fact, he told me, that having gotten lost on the moon meant that they did not reach their local target. They were on a mission to collect some rocks that may or may not have been able to allow geologists back on Earth to find out the moon's origins. And he was so upset on the way home, is how he described it, that he was looking out the window, wondering what it meant to be lost. And that is where he had his epiphany. Looking into the darkness, he came to the conclusion, he said, that man was more than he thought he was capable of, that we were somehow connected to a consciousness that was greater than ourselves. And that was the origin story of his quest. And I found that worthy of further exploration.
Annie, so much to discuss here. I didn't even get to ask you about the Army attempts to detect ESP in cats, but I will leave that for readers to discover. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Annie Jacobsen's new book is called Phenomena, The Secret History of the U.S. Government's Investigations into Extrasensory Perception and Psychokinesis. Alexandra Alter is here now to talk about what's going on in the publishing world. Alexandra, hi.
Hi, Pamela.
What is going on?
So Barnes & Noble had some news this week. They announced their new chief executive, and it's their fourth since 2013. So a lot of people have been cycling through this position. They promoted Demos Perneros, who was acting as their chief operating officer for the last 5 months, and he's only been with the company for that period of time. Previously, he was at Staples in a top executive position. So I think, the publishing industry is going to be watching him very closely. Investors and analysts are going to be watching him to see what direction he takes the company in. This is still the largest bookstore chain in the country, but they've really been struggling in recent years, just with, sales declines, revenue declines. Their digital strategy has been sort of a disaster for them. So they're still kind of digging out from that. And I think the thing that's concerning most to investors and analysts is that the general market for bookstores is pretty good. Mm-hmm. The independent market has really stabilized and grown. Amazon's even moving into physical bookstores, and they wouldn't be making a bet on it if they didn't think there was a customer base there. So it's sort of curious that Barnes & Noble hasn't really taken advantage of those sort of trends in the marketplace as
Are
much.
people excited about the fact that it's an insider? It's not like a big marquee name brought in from the outside.
That's true. It was just announced recently, so we haven't seen a lot of reactions, but Len Riggio, who bought Barnes & Noble in 1971 and expanded it into this massive national chain. He's been grooming him for the last few months. He's been talking up his leadership qualities in calls with investors. And I think they see him as a good choice because although Staples doesn't have a ton to do with book selling, it's a very different business. It's still a large chain. It's a specialty business. It's not like getting someone from Walmart or Costco.
Right.
He knows how to sort of handle specialty. I interviewed him, and he's well aware of the challenges that the company faces.
Mm-hmm.
And he's also, optimistic about the brand's kind of power with its fans and its consumers. I think one thing that a lot of analysts think is that Barnes & Noble really came into its own, sort of rose up with coffee culture and mall culture in the 90s. And so it had this kind of this superstructure to sort of glom onto, and that has really gone away. Malls are closing. E-commerce has become so much more of a force in book selling and everything else. So it might be the case that Barnes & Noble does need to shrink a bit to sort of find the right size.
How much experience does the new CEO have with the digital side, with digital strategy? Was he involved in that?
He was.
Staples?
At Staples, he oversaw all of their stores as well as the website. So I think he's comfortable with kind of balancing that realizing that a lot of people are going to be buying stuff online and you have to have a presence there. And it might, come at the expense of some of your physical foot traffic, but that you can find the right balance there. And, he's also kind of bullish about the company's new concept stores. They've opened 3 of them, and these are kind of newer models of a Barnes & Noble, sometimes with a smaller footprint, with outdoor space, with restaurants, with beer and wine. So they're kind of experimenting, and I think he sees there's a real need to experiment. These stores, a lot of them are older, and they kind of feel cluttered, or they just don't really feel contemporary. So he's looking to kind of change that model up a little bit.
I think a lot of people forget that back in Barnes & Noble's big expansion days that they knocked a lot of the independents out of business, but the end result now is that in many areas, the Barnes & Noble is the only bookstore they have. And so if these Barnes & Noble bookstores don't succeed, that leaves a lot of communities without a brick and mortar bookstore.
Exactly. I think that's something that communities are worried about, and the publishing industry is deeply worried about. I mean, they want to see a strong Barnes & Noble. They want them to be in every state and every marketplace because as you say, there are a lot of places where that's the only bookstore. It's also sort of this network for doing author tours and getting hundreds of people in. I think this week Caitlyn Jenner did a signing at a Manhattan Barnes & Noble. I mean, you still have these big events there. So authors and publishers are very concerned about the company's future and want to see it succeed.
And I imagine readers are too.
I'm
All right.
sure.
Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Joining me now are my colleagues, Greg Coles and Parl Siegel, and special guest star, Jenny Schusler. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, let's start with Parl. What are you reading this week?
I'm finally reading Lincoln in the Bardo, which is the first novel by George Saunders. And Saunders, actually, I'm curious about everybody, but Saunders is a huge blind spot for me. I think I read like a handful of stories over the years, but sort of never really sort of plunged into his work and picked this up on a whim. And I really don't have anything intelligent to say about it thus far, other than like, I'm just kind of undone by it. I was telling you guys that I cry on the way to work, on the way home. It's moving, it's strange. If you're not familiar with the premise, it's just kind of a bonkers idea. It's the story of Lincoln's son, Willie, who dies as a child. I think he's 14, and he goes into this place that the Tibetans call the Bardo, which is this transitional place between life and death. And it's sort of, this extended dialogue between other people he meets. It's about the nature of grief. It's sort of philosophical without being irritating. And I'm also just trying to figure out where the suspense in the book is coming from, because I am reading it at a sort of really brisk clip, which is somewhat surprising to me. I mean, it is like a deeply sad book. It could have been like in anybody else's hands, a very depressing book, but it's I don't know, it just sort of has these moments of lightness and wit, even as it's describing this 14-year-old terrible, untimely death. You guys, Jenny's read it.
Yes.
Yeah? Without spoiling anything, it's going to stay this good, right?
I
have a
think
feeling.
so.
Yeah?
I'm dying to talk to you about the ending, though.
Oh, my God.
Or,
Okay.
I mean, not that there's a dramatic event exactly,
Okay.
but about
But however
certain
he's going to
things
resolve it.
that
No,
get
it's-
resolved.
And I
right?
have that feeling right now. I'm like, how are you going to land this thing you've put in motion? So no, I'm tremendously excited to see where this goes and how this goes.
I like that your question is, where does the suspense in this book
Yeah.
come from? I've read enough of it to venture a guess,
Mm.
which is this whole question of the afterworld, the bardo as a kind of purgatory, where the spirits that you encounter in the book, it's partly made up of kind of historical sources and letters and things like that, but it's also partly this kind of chorus of ghostly voices who are residents of the bardo. And as in purgatory, the question is, will they move out of the bardo and
Sure.
on to kind of a better
Yeah.
afterworld, or out of this in-between stage and finally be able to die in peace?
Yeah, yeah. No, I
and,
think
and the
that's
question is, how does
yeah.
Willie Lincoln
Right.
play a role in letting them do that?
I guess, but I'm not so interested in that even. And I think my hunch is that what is very attractive to me about this book is that, so, I mean, as you're reading it, sort of the question that he's asking, the question animating is the book is, how do we live knowing that everything we love is going to die?
Sure.
Right? And so I think what is getting to me about this book is that, sure, there's this state called this bardo, this like liminal state, but a book is a bardo too. A book is a way in a moment of stopping and saying that all of this is going to go, but this is one place it's preserved.
Huh.
And I think that's why I'm going to make myself cry. I'm so moved by just the act of reading this book. And this book is a kind of offering.
I'm moved by your act of reading this book.
I don't even know. I know I'm ridiculous. But anyway, I'm highly like endorsing it, which is nothing new. But can I just ask a quick question? What are your blind spots? Like Saunders and a certain kind of short story writer. I really haven't read much of him. I haven't read so much Dennis Johnson. Do you guys have noticeable
We
or
all
blind
have our
spots?
feelings.
feel
What are your
like
big,
it's
what are your
a-
big blind spots?
I feel like I'm just swimming in a big ocean of blindness, and there's a few islands with maybe a few lights on where I have landed in the past.
If
But
you
I'm
were
just
saying that,
swimming
there's no hope
around
for
in
us.
this
There's
giant.
really no hope
No.
No, I have major blind spots. George Saunders is not one of them, and
Yeah.
Dennis Johnson is not one of them. I've read a ton of contemporary fiction, but I was not an English major, and so I never had cause to go back and read the classics, except as I've gone in and filled those spots in myself. So Henry James, a big blind spot. I finally went within the past year and a half or so and read Washington Square, but I haven't read most of Henry James.
See, I'm the opposite of you. I
Yeah,
have
me
like
too,
the
yeah.
I didn't get an MFA thing where I haven't read nearly as much contemporary fiction as I feel like I should, particularly in this role.
Yeah.
James Joyce, I read, The Dubliners, and I think I might have read Portrait of the Artist as a young man, but
Greg,
I
you would
haven't read
love
the
that.
major Joyce.
You specifically would go and read that next.
Yeah, I think I maybe have read Portrait of the Artist as a young man, but it's actually on my list
I
to
feel
pick
like
up
that's a
and,
book
and
that you know if
reread
you've
it.
read.
If I did, it was a long time ago. So it's one of those where I want to pick it up again and start to read it and spur my memory.
I think I read that book too young. I think that is a book that you would want
Yeah.
to reread if you had to read it in high school, which is just not the time, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like Pearl's description of books as a kind of bardo themselves. It ties into what I'm reading right now. I've been thinking a little bit about Anne Lamott because she is back on the nonfiction hardcover bestseller list with another kind of Christian celebration called Hallelujah Anyway. And this is her shtick now. This is what she does in book after book, is kind of talking about her faith and kind of proselytizing. And it puts her on the bestseller list all the time. People forget that back before she did the Christian books, back even before she did Operating Instructions and Bird by Bird, her writing manual, she really started out as a literary novelist. And she was celebrated for that. She was reviewed in Our Pages by Richard Bausch, and Tyler blurbed her. So she was kind of seen as a writer to watch. And then she went off on this side path of exploring her religious faith and has kind of solidified into that kind of a writer. But I went back and I've been reading her 1989 novel, All New People, which is very much to the point of a book as kind of a frozen moment in time. It's a coming-of-age novel about a young woman returning to her home in Northern California in Marin County and then looking back on her childhood in the 60s. And it's the title, All New People, comes from a thing that her father would always say. however bad something looks now, in 100 years, it's all new people, so you can forget about it. And it's this idea that, yes, everything that we celebrate and hold dear will be gone. And it's crushingly sad, but it's also, this is her effort to capture all of that.
All right, a question about categories and also about time. Do we think of a 1989 novel as contemporary fiction? I mean, I do.
Good question.
I don't. I think just stylistically it feels so different, you know? Like, I feel like now, I think maybe that there's more of a sense of like looking at people like Anne Beatty and Carver and even some of Mary Gaitskill's early stuff as a distinct moment.
And Jesus' Son.
Yeah, and
you
Jesus'
mentioned
Son.
Dennis
It feels to me
Johnson.
distinct. It
But
feels
it's not
to me like a
mid-century
moment.
fiction. So do we have a new thing, like late 20th century fiction?
I mean, it's funny. I was just starting college in 1989, so it's contemporary fiction where I'm concerned. But Parle was not born
I
in
was
1989.
8. Yeah, so deep into Hop on Pop at that stage. I'm
So
sure.
this gets into questions of generations and how you define yourself.
I was age shaming all of us. Jenny, what are you reading?
I got to say, I'm so relieved that Parle is reading Lincoln in the Bardo, a book I have read, because I often, when I've been a guest on this segment, have felt like massively underread, like, oh my God, I'm not reading enough.
Please
In a
stop
way,
saying
like
you're
the
the
existence
you're
of
the
is a
best read
spur.
person I know. And
Well,
this
I'm
is
going to
really
do, I'm embarrassed to report that I am not reading anything because and for the past week, roughly, in addition to attempting to do my job, I have been undertaking a great task of relocating I am moving out of my cubicle to a temporary space in preparation to move to a smaller desk. So I have had to clean out my vast accumulations of stuff from 12 years at the New York Times. And it made me think about Walter Benjamin wrote this famous essay called Unpacking My Library. And I've been going around joking, like, I want to write an essay called De-accommodating my library, because my books are like passengers being dragged kicking and screaming off of a United Airlines flight and thrown into some uncertain, bloody and battered fate. And if they had legal standings, I'm sure they would sue me. So I've been like under my desk, just amidst the dust, pulling out all of this stuff. And it's been really hard. I want to read a brief passage from the Walter Benjamin, and then this is his sort of, very genteel, German intellectual early 20th century version of this. And then I'm going to give you like the 21st century. So his essay begins, I am unpacking my library. Yes, I am. The books are not yet on the shelves, not yet touched by the mild boredom of order. I cannot march up and down their ranks to pass them in review before a friendly audience. You need not fear any of that. Instead, I must ask you to join me in the disorder of crates that have been wrenched open, the air saturated with the dust of wood, the floor covered with torn paper, to join me among piles of volumes that are seeing daylight again after 2 years of darkness, etc. And then he goes on to talk about kind of the passions of the collectors, and I would say I would call myself more of a hoarder, and I'm sure all of you are the same. We've all been in this business for many years, except for Parle, who's a baby, and we're bombarded with stuff, and it's you want to read them, you want to keep them. So I sort of found some interesting stuff. Like on the one hand, I saw under my desk, this long shelves of really great, substantial, scholarly books about American history. I was like, wow, I actually read all those books, and thought about them, and I even read a lot of the footnotes. And then there were just, lots of books I just sort of grabbed because I aspired to read them. A lot of formerly contemporary fiction, which is maybe no longer contemporary. And then I had kind of all these like little micro collections that I was really proud of. Like I had a whole shelf of books about books, sort of books about book history, about libraries, about
We are all
the
suckers for
fate
those.
of print. And so,
This
I've been
is like
tweeting out all these photos. I found weird things like this book called The Humanure Handbook, which was this kind of hippie how-to book about composting human waste. And I had bought this in a used bookstore in San Francisco like ages ago. And I'd become aware of this book because a million years ago when I worked at the New York Review of Books, there was this independent press listing in the back. So it's just, small publishers, self-publishers advertising their books. And there's always this big ad for the Humanure Handbook. And then when I actually saw it in the wild, I was like, oh my God. And I put it on our book compost pile. Not sure if it's speeding things up, but I just kind of wanted to read a couple of titles because I love these things. And I kept some of them. I threw some of them away. There was a book called Cruising the Library, Perversities in the Organization of Knowledge.
Bring me that one immediately.
A great book by the Harvard historian Ann Blair called Too Much to Know, Managing Scholarly Information Before the Modern Age. And that sounds like a very dry subtitle, but it's basically about information overload among early modern intellectuals, how did they deal with what seemed to them like this impossible profusion of knowledge in books?
What did they know?
Leah Price, another scholar at Harvard, wrote this great book called How to Do Things with Victorian Books. It was just all about
It's a great book.
the book as an object and a kind of thing in the Victorian world. And then there was this book, which I was going to toss, and then I'm like, no, I have to keep this, called The Accidental Diarist, A History of the Daily Planner in America. And I think Pamela, last time I checked in with you, as a diehard holdout for the print paper
Firm believer.
planner,
Yes.
I have kind of gone to the dark side, but I was like, everything has a history, including the Daily Planner. There was also this great book. I haven't read it, so I can't say it's a great book. Great looking book by Anthony Grafton, the Renaissance or the early modern historian at Princeton, called The Culture of Correction in Renaissance Europe. And it was all about how writers dealt with correctors in print shops. And as a reporter, where when you have to take a correction, it's like this terrible thing. I sort of wanted that of a prophylaxis. Anyway,
It's like a public humiliation.
Yeah,
The correction.
So the sum total of all of my ramblings here is I probably took, I would guess, maybe 200 books home, gradually day by day, carrying them. On a couple of occasions, I took taxis in big bags. A lot of them went on the toss pile. I tried to send a lot of them to what I've been calling no-kill shelters. Like I had these great bilingual editions from this Harvard University Press project called the Murty Library. So it was all this literature from the subcontinent, or I'm not, but in many languages, not just Sanskrit, beautifully produced. And I'm not going to read these books, but I wrote about them. And so I gave them to a friend of mine who's a scholar of Tibet, actually. But anyway, I wanted to close with one quote of a book I really love, a little book that was published, I think, in the early 2000s in translation, it's by this Mexican literary critic named Gabriel Zaid. It was called So Many Books, and it was a lament about the profusion of books at this sort of moment of digital transition. But he has this great quote, which I sort of think of as my credo, and I'm going to change the pronouns here. He said, "It is the mark of a truly civilized person to own thousands of unread books without losing her composure or her desire for more." So I've lost my composure, but not my desire for more.
Pamela, what are you reading?
Well, before I go into that, I want to say that there are lots of cast-offs around the office, as many people on our floor are moving around and consolidating or getting rid of things. And my favorite cast-off that I've seen so far was a book called The Useful Book. And it was not a finished book, but it was like a 2015 galley. And I loved the idea of sort of trying to come up with a backstory that like someone was like, this is what I need.
Yeah.
I have to have this. I'm not even going to wait for the finished book.
Mm-hmm.
And then like 2 years later, they're like, either, I don't know, do they no longer need it? Did they not find it useful? Did they acquire everything that they needed from this book? It was sort of one of these compendiums of how to do things that none of us know how to do anymore. But what I'm reading is still the Ben Bradley memoir, A Good Life, which is really enjoyable. It's actually quite the page turner, and I'm sure I'll be done with it by next week. But I was interrupted by Sheryl Sandberg, and I'm at a point right now about midway through the book where there are so many areas that he covers that are still sort of resonate. And what I was reading last night was he was talking about the period where Newsweek was being sold to the Washington Post and how he personally negotiated part of the sort of early sale with Phil Gramm. And we know now from reading Katharine Graham's personal history about Phil Gramm's bipolar disorder. So in retrospect, Bradley knows that he got Phil Gramm sort of in a manic up period when he was like, sure, I'll buy Newsweek. And then sort of a little bit later into the process, Gramm must have gotten depressed. And it's just interesting to read that in the context of having read Katharine Graham's memoir. And he also writes, JFK was his neighbor in Georgetown. And this interesting relationship he had as a journalist who was a personal friend of the president whom he was reporting on. And it's a kind of relationship that I think it just wouldn't stand today in terms of our journalistic standards with conflict of interest. And even at the time was kind of awkward because he would go over on a sort of social visit with Jackie and JFK to their house, but bring a notebook and write things down. And apparently Jackie, who was really distrustful of the press, did not like this. So sometimes they would sort of specify this is off the record, don't write this part down. But other times Kennedy would say, make sure you get this part, or like, did you add in that? It's easy to forget how young Jackie was. She was 31 when they entered the White House, which is just shocking, especially as someone who's very far from being 31, to imagine what that must have been like to experience all of that at that age. And then the final thing that struck me is when Kennedy took office, you know, he was sort of immediately confronted with the situation in Laos and with the Cuban crisis, and it was so far outside of what he had campaigned on. And it's just this recurring theme in American electoral politics where people run for the presidency having all of these domestic ambitions, and then they get into office and they're completely distracted by foreign policy. And we've seen that to a certain extent with the current administration. But Kennedy had said, I'm just going to read a little passage from the book. A few months into his presidency, Kennedy talked to me about how foreign affairs were dominating his life. During the campaign, he had not dwelled on foreign affairs, except for using the so-called missile gap, because that was not his field of expertise, and Nixon was claiming it as his, and because there just weren't that many foreign affair issues kicking around. Quemoy and Matsu, two small Formosan islands of no strategic value, but coveted by Red China, were perhaps the major foreign hotspots. It's just kind of remarkable to think of like one of the rare moments in time where foreign affairs weren't dominating the news cycle. Of course, it quickly changed. But I did think it was interesting sort of how far outside Kennedy's area of interest and expertise foreign affairs were, considering that this was sort of the era where we became so embroiled in Vietnam.
Oh, fascinating.
Your nonfiction moment this week on what we're reading. All right, Jenny, Greg, Carl, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.